The midday
Don't
sun
worry,
burned
I'm
down on the
here.
heart of Redstone,
I'll
a
help you get
small
well.
western town where the dust never seemed to settle, and secrets traveled faster than the wind. Carla stood alone in the center of Main Street, her black dress stark against the pale earth, the fabric clinging to her figure as if mourning with her. She was young, much too young to wear the widow's veil, and beautiful in a way that was both striking and unsettling to the men and women who watched from their porches and shop fronts. Her mere presence seemed to cast a long shadow across the wooden sidewalks, a shadow that only deepened the town's unease. She could feel their eyes, every glance sharp as a blade, slicing through her composure. Some women pretended to busy themselves with washing or sweeping, but their hands slowed as she passed, their whispers loud enough for Carla to hear her name tangled in accusations and old wives' tales. The men's suspicion was less subtle, a narrowing of eyes, a stiffening of posture, a hand that drifted closer to the handle of a holstered revolver. Carla kept her chin high, but the weight of their judgment pressed down harder than the summer heat. Just days before, she had been a wife, Mrs. Carla Tyndale, married to a good man whose laughter once echoed down these very streets. Now, she was an outcast, a widow marked not just by loss, but by suspicion and fear. Her husband's sudden, mysterious death had unsettled everyone, but it was the circumstances, the things they found in her house, the old stories about her remedies, that made them recoil in superstition, as if grief itself wasn't enough to endure. That morning, the town council had gathered behind the frosted glass windows of the general store. The leaders of Redstone huddled together in voices hushed and urgent. They spoke not just of grief or justice, but of the danger Carla posed, a danger they couldn't name, but felt crawling on their skin like a fever. Outside, children lingered at the corners, staring at Carla with wide, uncertain eyes until their mothers hissed and pulled them away. Rumor, in Redstone, was a living thing. It slithered from house to house, grew fangs and claws, and made monsters out of grief and difference. Some said Carla had brought calamity on her own home, that she was a witch like in the old country tales, cursing the man she claimed to love. Others said she had been seen gathering strange herbs at dusk, muttering to herself beneath the weeping willow behind her cabin. A few, remembering the kindness she'd shown them once, shook their heads, but kept their voices low. In Redstone, even mercy could make you a target. The day stretched on, the heat shimmering on the horizon. Carla moved through town as if in a waking nightmare, her every step echoing on the empty boards. She remembered how, just weeks ago, her life had been filled with the simple joys of the frontier. A husband's laughter, a garden full of sage and lavender, neighbors who greeted her at church with genuine smiles. All of that seemed like another world now, one she could never return to. Behind closed doors, the town council's meeting grew more heated. Mayor Benton, a man with a thick mustache and a reputation for order, leaned in close to the others. "We can't ignore this," he said. "Folks are scared. If we let this go on, who knows what will happen next? Livestock dying, children falling sick, the well running dry. People need someone to blame." Councilman Avery, whose wife had never taken kindly to Carla's remedies, nodded. She was always different, always meddling where she didn't belong. "She's grieving," offered Mrs. Childers, the only woman in the room, her voice trembling. "Perhaps we ought to show some compassion." Benton's answer was sharp. "Compassion's fine, but it won't keep order. The people are demanding action." Outside, the whispers thickened. A group of older women gathered near the church, voices rising with every new embellishment. One claimed she'd seen Carla speaking to the wind at midnight. Another insisted she'd found a bird's skull on her doorstep, surely a warning. A third shook her head, her gaze darting from the others to Carla's solitary figure. There's something not right about that girl. Never has been. As the sun dipped lower, Carla turned away from the main street and hurried home, her heart pounding with dread. The little cottage she had shared with her husband was now a prison of silence. Shadows gathered in the corners, creeping along the floorboards. She sat by the window, staring out at the horizon as night approached, wondering what would become of her. She didn't see the faces pressed to the glass in the darkness, or the figures hurrying from house to house, spreading news that could never be taken back. In the morning, she would awake to find that her world had grown even smaller, the town's suspicion now sharpened into something dangerous. But for now, Carla sat alone in her grief, clutching her husband's wedding band in her fist, and listened to the wind whisper secrets only she seemed to hear. The days that followed her husband's death were a blur, thick with grief and suspicion. But as the sun crept over Redstone's rooftops, it did little to warm the chill settling over Carla's life. The cottage, once filled with the gentle music of laughter and whispered dreams, now seemed haunted by absence. Yet the townsfolk didn't see sorrow when they looked at Carla. They saw something to fear. As she tried to carry on, memories returned unbidden. Carla recalled simpler times, before loss became her shadow. Her father had been the town blacksmith, a broad-shouldered, patient man whose hands shaped iron and whose heart shaped Carla into someone unafraid of hard work or standing apart. She learned from him the value of quiet strength and the subtle language of kindness. In those days, Carla moved through Redstone with her head held high, admired for her beauty and her gentle ways. When she married Thomas Tyndale, the world seemed to bloom anew. Their days together were humble but joyful, planting herbs in the garden behind the cottage, sharing simple meals, and helping neighbors however they could. Carla's hands, deft from years at her father's forge, were equally skilled at brewing teas and crafting salves. She became known for her knowledge of remedies, often called upon to soothe fevers or calm frightened children. Yet it was this knowledge that now marked her as an outsider. Old stories clung to Carla like burrs, tales told in frightened whispers, that she could cure the barren, that she could heal with a touch, that she saw things others could not. In a place like Redstone, such stories were dangerous. The night Thomas died replayed in Carla's mind, vivid and surreal. He had been well at supper, smiling as he described the day's work at the livery. Later, as darkness fell, he grew pale and cold. Carla worked desperately to bring down his fever, reaching for the remedies she trusted most. Feverfew, willow bark, cool cloths, but nothing helped. By dawn, he was gone, leaving Carla with only questions and a cold, empty bed. When the town's women came to help, they found her weeping over Thomas, surrounded by bundles of herbs and trinkets carved from bone and wood. One woman, suspicious, lifted a string of dried roots and held it aloft for all to see, her expression twisted in fear. "Witch's work," she murmured, and soon the whole town knew. As the days passed, stories about Carla multiplied. Some remembered the time she'd brewed a tea that eased a neighbor's pain. Others darkly recalled when a woman, barren for years, conceived after drinking Carla's concoction. It was easy to draw a line between miracle and menace. In a town ruled by superstition, Carla's compassion was her undoing. It wasn't just the strange herbs and whispered prayers that frightened the townsfolk. It was the idea that Carla had power, the kind that could not be explained by scripture or science. That power, to their minds, could turn against anyone. Carla tried to ignore the muttered prayers and the way people crossed themselves when she passed. She kept her eyes lowered and her hands busy, tending her garden and mending old clothes. But nothing she did could soften the suspicions growing like thistles among her neighbors. The prejudice was more than words. It seeped into every corner of her life, poisoning small kindnesses and turning friends into strangers. The storekeeper, once friendly, now watched her carefully when she bought flour, his fingers tight around the scales. Children who used to gather for stories now hurried past, eyes downcast, urged on by mothers who whispered warnings. One afternoon, as Carla watered the drooping sage in her garden, she heard voices drifting through the fence. "Should have known better than to trust a woman with secrets," one neighbor hissed. Her own husband was probably the first to fall under her spell. Carla's heart pounded with a mix of rage and despair. She wanted to scream at them, to insist on her innocence, but she knew words would only feed their fear. At night, Carla found solace only in memories. She remembered how, after her mother died, her father would tell her stories of strong women who endured, who turned pain into wisdom. She clung to those stories now, drawing quiet strength from their example. But strength was not enough to shield her from the relentless tide of suspicion. The council's whispers had grown into a chorus, demanding action. Someone scrawled a message in the dust outside her cottage. "Witch." The letters crooked and angry. The message felt like a curse, a sentence already passed. As dusk fell one evening, Carla spotted a small, silent figure watching from across the road. It was Millie, the orphan girl, thin as a wisp, her dress patched and faded. Unlike the others, Millie's gaze was soft, full of a longing Carla recognized, a need for belonging, for safety. Carla managed a tired smile, and Millie, as if caught in the act, disappeared behind a barrel. In that brief moment, Carla saw herself reflected in the girl, alone, misunderstood, but still reaching for hope. The next day would bring more than whispered rumors. The storm was gathering, and Carla sensed that everything she once knew was about to be torn apart. But for one last night, she allowed herself to remember happiness, even as darkness settled heavy and close around her heart. The night the world changed for Carla began with a low, restless wind that scraped against the shutters and whispered through the cottonwoods. She lay awake, unable to find rest, her mind circling the same questions. How had everything turned so quickly? Where would it end? Shadows stretched across the floorboards, and the air inside the cottage seemed thick, charged with a sense of foreboding. In the small hours, Carla heard a commotion rising from the center of town, voices cutting through the hush, torches flickering in the darkness. She slipped from her bed and pressed her face to the cool window pane, heart pounding as she watched a knot of townspeople moving with grim purpose. Women, many of them the same neighbors Carla had once shared bread with, marched in a ragged line, their faces pinched with anger and fear, their eyes hard as river stones. They reached her door, and for a heartbeat, the world stood still. Then fists pounded against the wood, shouts demanding she open up. The first stone shattered a window, spraying shards across the kitchen table. Carla's breath caught in her throat. There was no use pleading, no sense in trying to explain. The verdict had already been whispered from porch to porch, turning suspicion into certainty. She barely had time to grab her shawl before the door burst open. The women surged inside, trampling over the threshold. Hands clawed at her belongings, knocking pots to the floor, overturning chairs, tearing the house apart in their search for evidence of evil. Someone seized a pouch of dried herbs and flung it across the room. Another upended the chest at the foot of her bed, spilling keepsakes and worn letters onto the dirt floor. "Get out, witch!" a voice hissed from the crowd, and others took up the cry, louder and louder until it drowned out the sound of Carla's own pulse thundering in her ears. They drove her from the cottage, pushing her into the open night. Carla stumbled down the front steps, shards of glass crunching underfoot. All around, faces peered from behind curtains, some with satisfaction, some with regret, most with fear. No one offered help. No one spoke in her defense. At the edge of the crowd, the town council stood grim and silent, arms folded, hats pulled low over their eyes. Mayor Benton stepped forward, his voice flat and official as he read from a hastily written proclamation. For the safety of all, Carla Tyndale is hereby declared an outcast. She is forbidden from setting foot in Redstone until further notice. There was no trial, no chance to protest. The words fell heavy and final. The law, in this moment, was nothing more than the voice of the fearful mob. Carla turned away from the flames and angry faces, the bundle of her life's belongings clutched tightly in her arms. She walked down the center of Main Street, her head bowed, her steps echoing in the stillness. The town seemed to shrink behind her with every stride. With each step, her identity as a neighbor, a wife, a healer faded into memory, leaving only the empty shape of an exile. Beyond the edge of town, the prairie opened up wide and silent. The moon hung low, painting the grass in pale silver. Carla's feet ached, her hands trembled, but she kept moving, afraid to stop, afraid that if she did, the darkness would swallow her completely. Unseen, a small figure followed her at a distance. Millie, the orphan girl, crept through the shadows, her bare feet silent on the earth. She had watched the scene unfold from behind a stack of barrels, her heart pounding with dread and helplessness. When Carla disappeared into the night, Millie hesitated only a moment before slipping away after her, the urge to flee stronger than the pull of fear. Carla didn't notice her at first. She pressed on, ducking beneath low branches, crossing the narrow creek behind the town. Only when she stopped to catch her breath did she hear the faint sound of footsteps in the brush. She spun, fear leaping in her chest, but saw only Millie, thin, shivering, eyes wide with worry. For a moment, neither spoke. The wind rustled through the leaves, carrying distant echoes of the town's anger. Then Carla knelt, exhaustion and compassion warring on her face. She recognized the desperation in Millie's eyes, the silent plea for belonging. Without a word, she took the girl's hand and led her deeper into the woods. They walked until the torchlight faded and the prairie swallowed all sign of civilization. Carla found a sheltered hollow beneath a stand of cedars and began gathering branches for a crude shelter. Millie, uncertain at first, helped as best she could, her small hands trembling with cold and fear. As the night wore on, they huddled together for warmth, sharing a silence that spoke of loss and exile, but also of fragile hope. Carla wrapped her shawl around Millie's shoulders and looked up at the stars, searching for comfort in their distant light. Behind them, Redstone settled into uneasy sleep. In the woods, two outcasts forged the first threads of a bond that would change both their lives, even as a greater storm gathered on the horizon, promising danger and unexpected redemption. Dawn found Carla and Millie huddled together beneath the canopy of cedars, their makeshift shelter little more than a nest of branches and moss. The morning air was cold and sharp, stinging their skin as they woke from restless sleep. Carla felt every bone in her body ache from the hard ground, but she forced herself upright, brushing leaves from her dress and scanning the clearing for any sign of danger. The woods were still, but her instincts told her they could not remain there long. They were outcasts now, hunted not only by the fear of wild animals, but by the anger of townsfolk who believed their exile was not enough. With little food and only a threadbare shawl for warmth, every moment became a lesson in survival. Carla drew on memories from her childhood, recalling how her father had taught her to find wild onions and sorrel, to catch rainwater in cupped leaves, to watch for the signs of predators. She knelt beside Millie and spoke softly, her words less a comfort than an instruction. Together, they set about the work of staying alive. Carla fashioned a crude snare from a strip of her petticoat and set it near a cluster of animal tracks, hoping to catch a rabbit or a squirrel. She sent Millie searching for dry wood, showing her how to judge by weight and smell which branches would burn and which would only smoke. As the girl fumbled through the undergrowth, Carla kept a wary eye on the horizon, alert for the flicker of torchlight or the distant sound of dogs. It was not an easy life. Hunger gnawed at them, and thirst made their mouths raw. The first night, rain swept through the trees, soaking their shelter and leaving them shivering, teeth chattering, as they tried to stay close for warmth. Yet it was during those long, miserable hours that the first fragile trust began to grow between them. Millie, silent and wary, watched Carla with wide eyes, learning by example how to bind a cut finger with a strip of cloth, how to chew willow bark to ease a pounding headache, how to walk quietly so as not to scare the birds from their nests. Days blurred together in a rhythm of struggle and small victories. They found berries one afternoon, a patch of wild raspberries hidden beneath the brambles. Millie's face lit up in astonished relief as she popped the first tart fruit into her mouth, juice staining her fingers. Carla smiled for the first time in what felt like years, the brief sweetness a reminder that not all things in the world were bitter. The woods offered danger as well as sustenance. One night, as they huddled beneath their lean-to, the yowl of a bobcat echoed nearby, sending Millie scrambling to Carla's side. Carla pulled the girl close and whispered stories of braver times, of fireside tales and songs her mother once sang, the old melodies weaving a fragile sense of safety around them. It was not just beasts they had to fear. On the third day, Carla heard the crack of distant voices and the jangle of horses' tack, men from Redstone searching the woods. Millie shrank into the shadows, but Carla knew they could not remain hidden forever. She gathered their few belongings and led Millie deeper into the trees, heart pounding as she picked a path along a narrow deer trail. As the days wore on, Millie's courage grew. She learned to tell poison ivy from wild mint, to use flat stones to dig shallow wells in the creek bed when the rainwater ran out. When Carla twisted her ankle crossing a patch of loose stones, Millie found a sturdy branch and insisted she use it as a crutch, her small frame set with determination. In those quiet moments of shared hardship, Carla saw the orphan girl's spirit shining through, scared but resilient, scarred but not broken. Then came the night Millie fell ill. It started with a chill, then a low fever that climbed relentlessly. Carla pressed a trembling hand to the girl's forehead and felt fear as sharp as a blade. She tried everything she knew, Herbal teas, cool compresses, whispered prayers, but nothing broke the fever's grip. Millie's breaths grew shallow, her small hands clutching at Carla's sleeve, eyes glassy with delirium. Desperation drove Carla to a choice she had never wanted to make. Under the cover of darkness, she wrapped Millie in a blanket and crept through the forest, skirting the edges of Redstone's outlying farms. She kept to the shadows, avoiding the lantern light of night watchmen, her heart hammering as she neared a ramshackle general store on the outskirts of a neighboring settlement. She crept to the back, searching for an unlocked window. Finding none, she pried open a loose board with trembling fingers and slipped inside, moving quickly between crates and shelves. She grabbed a bottle of tonic and a packet of quinine, leaving a few coins behind as payment, though she knew theft was another crime for which she could be hunted. Every moment felt like a lifetime as she slipped back into the night, the precious medicines clutched to her chest. She returned to Millie, dosing the child with careful hands, whispering old lullabies as she prayed for the fever to break. The next dawn found Carla exhausted, her nerves frayed, but Millie's color slowly returned, her breathing easing as sleep finally claimed her. In the deep hush of the woods, Carla realized they had become more than outcasts. They were now each other's hope, bound together not by blood, but by the fierce will to survive. And perhaps, one day, to find their place in the world again. The days in the wilderness grew heavier, marked by restless anxiety and the raw, aching hunger that gnawed at both Carla and Millie. The memory of torches and angry faces from Redstone haunted Carla's dreams. Every distant bark or human shout made her freeze, certain the town's wrath would catch up with them. The forest felt both sanctuary and prison, thick with shadows, its silence interrupted only by the call of distant crows or the rustle of a passing deer. Millie grew stronger with each passing day, the fever slowly replaced by color in her cheeks and new energy in her limbs. Carla found herself fiercely protective, teaching Millie how to whittle sticks for kindling, how to spot edible mushrooms, how to listen for the subtle signs of danger. The girl soaked up every lesson, eager and quiet, her bond with Carla forged through trial and tenderness. But safety was always temporary. One morning, as Carla checked her snares along the riverbank, she heard voices drifting through the trees, sharp, urgent, and unmistakably close. She caught Millie's eye and signaled for silence. Together, they crept through the undergrowth, Carla's heart pounding with the familiar terror of being hunted. Through the tangle of brush, she caught glimpses of men in broad-brimmed hats, rifles slung over shoulders, dogs straining at leashes. It was a search party, faces hard with resolve and suspicion. Carla could make out fragments of angry conversation, her name spoken like a curse, accusations of kidnapping, of livestock cursed by her supposed witchery. The whole of Redstone's old fear now had a target, and it was Carla. Clutching Millie's hand, Carla led them away from the river, deeper into the tangled green, heart pounding as branches snagged at her dress. They moved in silence for what felt like hours, stopping only when even the dog's barking faded behind them. Exhausted, they collapsed behind a fallen log, Millie trembling with exhaustion and fear. Carla wrapped an arm around her, whispering assurances she barely believed herself. The next day, hunger pressed in hard. Their foraged supplies had dwindled to nearly nothing, and Carla knew they would not last much longer if they kept running. As dusk fell, a cold drizzle began, soaking them to the bone and chilling their spirits. Carla scanned the horizon for any sign of shelter, and finally, through the mist, spotted a thin plume of smoke rising in the distance, curling above the treetops. She hesitated, torn between the risk of discovery and the desperate need for help. But Millie's hollow eyes left her no choice. Carla pulled her to her feet, and they stumbled through the gathering gloom, following the scent of wood smoke and the promise of warmth. At the forest's edge, nestled in a small clearing, stood a weathered cabin, smoke puffing from its chimney, a lantern glowing in the window. Carla approached cautiously, her nerves on edge, but the cabin radiated a quiet order, tools neatly stacked by the door, a tidy garden clinging to life along the fence. She raised a trembling fist and knocked, ready to run if the wrong face appeared. Instead, the door opened to reveal a man in his 40s, tall and lean, his hair touched with gray at the temples, spectacles perched low on his nose. He wore a clean shirt and carried himself with a physician's calm. His gaze moved from Carla's weary, mud-streaked face to Millie, shivering behind her, and his expression softened instantly. Without a word, he ushered them inside, gesturing to a chair by the fire. The cabin's warmth wrapped around them, the scents of simmering broth and herbs rising from the hearth. The man introduced himself as Dr. John Harper, a widower who had retreated to the edge of civilization after losing his wife to illness years before. Carla tried to explain, her voice rough with exhaustion, but John simply nodded, recognizing more in their haggard appearance than words could tell. He moved quietly, fetching towels and warm water, tending to Millie's still fragile health with gentle hands and practiced skill. Carla watched as he checked the girl's pulse and temperature, the worry in his brow slowly easing. John recognized Carla's skill, asking quietly about her knowledge of herbs as he prepared a tincture for Millie's cough. Carla answered cautiously, but soon found herself discussing the plants she'd gathered, the salves she had made, the old remedies passed down from her mother and father. For the first time since the exile, she felt a flicker of hope. Here was someone who did not shrink from her knowledge or cast suspicious glances, but listened and understood. As the night deepened, John invited them to rest in the spare room, assuring them they were safe. Carla lay awake for a long time, the glow of the fire flickering against the walls, Millie's breathing finally slow and steady beside her. The storm of the past days seemed to recede, replaced by a fragile peace and the distant promise of safety. Outside, the wind howled, carrying with it the ghosts of old accusations and fears. But within the cabin's walls, something new began to take root. Trust, quiet and hesitant, growing in the warmth of simple kindness and shared understanding. The days that followed in Dr. John Harper's cabin offered Carla and Millie a fragile sense of sanctuary. The forest pressed close around them. The outside world kept at bay by distance, silence, and the quiet routines of survival. Inside, the rooms were modest but warm. Each morning began with a pot of strong coffee on the stove and the sharp, sweet scent of fresh herbs drying above the hearth. John moved through his days with a calm purpose, tending to his small garden and his patients from nearby settlements, who sometimes braved the woods to seek his skill. For the first time since the exile, Carla felt her nerves begin to uncoil. Millie, too, bloomed in the warmth and safety of the place, her cheeks regaining their color, her laughter returning in small bursts as she played with the stray cat that haunted the porch. Carla took on chores without being asked, fetching water, sweeping floors, helping John organize his shelves of bottles and dried roots. The rhythm of honest work soothed her frayed spirit. But peace could not last. News traveled swiftly, even through the wilderness. From a passing trapper, John learned that the search party from Redstone had not given up. In fact, the hunt had grown more dangerous, fueled now not just by fear, but by the bitterness of a man named Samuel Keene. Keene, whose brother had once courted Carla and lost, now made it his mission to see her punished, stirring others with tales of curses, hexes, and missing livestock. His anger turned the ordinary into the ominous. Every sick calf or spoiled crop was now whispered to be Carla's revenge. As the days wore on, John saw the toll this took on Carla. She walked with her shoulders tensed, listening for sounds outside the windows, scanning the edge of the woods for any sign of movement. At night, she often woke from troubled dreams, the cries of the mob echoing in her memory. But she refused to let fear control her. Instead, she busied herself with healing. She taught Millie how to make poultices for wounds, how to dry and grind bark for teas, how to listen for the subtle signals in the cries of the birds and the scent of rain on the wind. John observed these lessons quietly, sometimes stepping in to offer his own knowledge, a more scientific, clinical approach to illness, but never dismissing Carla's traditional methods. Over time, respect grew between them, rooted in shared purpose and mutual loss. John had buried his wife not many years before, her absence a quiet ache that never fully faded. Carla saw this in the way he lingered over her photograph on the mantel, in the gentle way he spoke of memory. She understood grief and the way it could harden or soften a soul. One afternoon, as the three gathered roots near the edge of the property, Millie spotted smoke on the horizon. For a moment, panic gripped them, memories of torches and angry voices, but John recognized the pattern. "Someone's burning stubble fields out near the old road," he murmured. Still, the reminder of how close the world's dangers remained set Carla's nerves on edge. It was that night that Keene and his men came nearest. Footsteps crunched in the brush outside. Dogs barked, their baying echoing through the trees. John doused the lantern, pulling Millie away from the window as Carla pressed herself against the wall, clutching a heavy iron pan. They sat in darkness, hearts thundering, as voices drifted through the night, men searching for the witch and the stolen child. The men passed, their curses fading with the distance, but the message was clear. Safety was always temporary. The townspeople's ignorance and anger could reach even the deepest woods. Yet, inside the cabin, something began to change. John used his reputation to defend Carla when neighbors questioned her presence. He explained to anyone who'd listen that her so-called witchcraft was folk medicine, her remedies the result of skill and tradition, not malice. He treated her not as an outcast, but as a peer, a healer, a survivor, someone worthy of dignity. Millie recovered fully, her childhood slowly returning as the weight of sickness and fear lifted. She came to trust Carla as a mother, clinging to her in moments of anxiety, seeking her advice and comfort. The three became a fragile family, united not by blood, but by shared hardship and kindness. Still, Carla could not shake the feeling that their peace was only a pause between storms. She often stood at the window long after the others slept, watching the woods for any flicker of torchlight. Her mind tangled with memories and questions. Would the truth ever come to light? Could innocence survive in a world so eager for blame? But in the soft lamplight of John's kitchen, as Millie laughed and John recounted stories of his own frontier childhood, Carla let herself hope. They were not alone anymore. And in that hope, A new resolve began to grow, a determination not just to survive, but to fight for the truth and the chance at a life rebuilt from the ashes. The slow rhythm of days in John Harper's cabin gave Carla and Millie a taste of fragile belonging, yet the specter of injustice never faded. Even as Millie's cheeks bloomed with new health and John's gentle presence steadied Carla's nerves, unease continued to haunt the edges of every sunrise. Carla knew that peace in exile was no real freedom. To truly reclaim her life, she needed to clear her name and uncover the darkness that had poisoned her world. The first real crack in the walls of secrecy came on a blustery autumn morning. While gathering kindling along the property's edge, Carla and Millie stumbled upon a torn scrap of paper tangled in the brambles. It was a letter, badly weathered but still legible, the ink running in places. Carla knelt in the mud, smoothing the page with trembling hands. The message was unsigned, but unmistakable in its intent, an anonymous warning addressed to Thomas, her late husband, hinting at danger from someone close within Redstone's council. Carla's mind raced. Who could have sent such a letter? Why had Thomas never spoken of it? She brought it to John, and together they pored over the scrawled words. The lines hinted at jealousy, old grudges, and a plot twisting beneath the surface of Redstone's pious respectability. John read the note twice, his brow furrowing. "Someone wanted your husband gone," he said quietly, "and they wanted you blamed." The truth began to take shape. Carla recalled the night Thomas fell ill, the bitter taste of the tea he drank before bed, and the suddenness with which death swept through their cottage. She'd blamed herself for failing to save him, never daring to imagine foul play. Now the terrible possibility crept in. A trusted face, a neighbor, a friend, slipping poison into her husband's cup while planting the seeds of her ruin. Determined to learn more, Carla and John began to investigate in secret. John's reputation gave him an excuse to visit Redstone, where he gathered stories and listened carefully to the undercurrents of conversation. He learned that Councilman Avery, a man long jealous of Thomas's modest success and secretly hostile toward Carla's foreign ways, had quietly visited their cottage the day before Thomas died. Avery was known for his sharp tongue and his bitter pride, both easily concealed behind a facade of community concern. As autumn deepened, Carla discovered another clue, a small, empty vial hidden in the shed behind their old cottage when she and John dared to return under cover of night. The glass was stamped with the name of a rare poison, used in tiny doses for certain animal ailments, but fatal if misused. Carla remembered seeing Avery talking with the local apothecary, remembered his shadow crossing her kitchen window that fateful afternoon. The pieces fell into place with grim logic, but suspicions alone were not enough. They needed proof that would withstand the town's fearful eyes. Their secret visits to Redstone became more daring, John using his medical practice as cover while Carla moved like a ghost through back alleys and side doors. Once, while hiding near the council hall, Carla overheard a heated argument between Avery and the former maid of the general store, a woman dismissed for disloyalty soon after Thomas's death. Her voice shook as she demanded payment for her silence, threatening to reveal what she knew about that night. It was Millie, with her quiet presence and sharp eyes, who coaxed the woman into confiding the truth. The maid admitted she'd seen Avery slipping away from Carla's cottage after dusk, carrying a parcel wrapped in a handkerchief stained dark with something she could not name. Fear of reprisal had kept her quiet, but guilt and kindness toward Carla finally broke her resolve. Carla and John now had a tapestry of evidence: the warning letter, The vial of poison, the maid's trembling testimony, the knowledge was cold comfort. With every discovery, the danger grew. Avery was no fool. He commanded respect and influence, and would not hesitate to destroy those who threatened his standing. Yet for the first time since her exile, Carla felt the faint heat of righteous anger flickering beneath her sorrow. She was not just a victim, not only a scapegoat. She was a woman determined to reclaim her dignity and defend the child who had become her own. Late one evening, with Millie fast asleep and John tending the fire, Carla gathered the evidence into a worn satchel. Her hands shook, not with fear, but with the weight of her resolve. She knew what had to come next. No more running, no more hiding in the woods. The truth would have to face the town in the open, and the real villain, hidden for so long behind power and piety, would be exposed. As the autumn wind howled through the trees, Carla gazed out the window, her reflection fierce and resolute. The road back to Redstone would be perilous, but she would walk it with her head held high, the burden of innocence and hope now heavier, but finally perhaps worth carrying. The decision was made in silence. One cold dawn, with frost crisping the fallen leaves, Carla slipped quietly from her bed. Her mind churned with fear and determination, but her hands were steady as she packed the evidence. The vial, the letter, the maid's sworn testimony, into a leather satchel. John met her at the door, his face grave and resolute. Millie stood by the window, her small frame tense with worry, but Carla knelt and offered a reassuring embrace. "It's time," she whispered, knowing the words were meant as much for herself as for the girl. Together, Carla and John set out on the long walk back to Redstone. The forest that had hidden them now seemed to lean away, branches creaking in the cold, as if aware of the gravity of what was about to unfold. Each step was heavy with memory, of exile, betrayal, and a longing for justice that would not be denied. By the time they reached the outskirts of town, the streets were alive with morning bustle. News of their arrival spread faster than wildfire. Curious faces pressed against windows. Townsfolk gathered in clusters, some shocked to see Carla returned, others clutching children close and muttering old superstitions under their breath. But there were a few, faces once familiar, who looked away in shame, guilt flickering in their eyes. It was market day, the square crowded with wagons and chatter, the clatter of hooves against stone. John led the way toward the meeting hall, his posture calm but unyielding. He requested an audience with the council, his reputation as a healer and fair-minded man lending weight to his words. Soon, a crowd gathered, drawn by the murmurs of something extraordinary about to take place. Inside the town hall, the atmosphere crackled with tension. The council members took their places, Avery at their center, his expression smug but watchful. The mayor, pale and anxious, called for order, his gavel striking the wood with shaky authority. Carla stood at John's side, her heart thundering, but her voice was clear as she laid out her evidence. She spoke not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever suffered at the hands of gossip, ignorance, and cruelty. She presented the torn letter, the vial with its damning label, and finally, the maid's written testimony. Each piece of truth landed like a stone in the still water of the assembly, sending ripples through the crowd. Avery's composure began to fracture. He blustered, denying everything, accusing Carla of lies and trickery. But John's calm, measured voice cut through the noise. He explained how the so-called witchcraft was nothing more than folk medicine, remedies passed from one generation to the next. He described the effects of the poison, the opportunity and motive, the jealous bitterness Avery had harbored for years. The maid, summoned with the council's authority, entered the hall with trembling hands. She looked directly at Avery, her eyes brimming with the courage it took to finally speak the truth. She recounted what she had seen: Avery's furtive visit to the Tyndale cottage, the mysterious parcel, his whispered threats if she told a soul. Whispers swept through the assembly. A few townspeople, emboldened by the unfolding events, stepped forward to add their own suspicions. Strange encounters with Avery, missing animals, threats whispered at night. The council, seeing the tide of opinion shift, pressed Avery harder. His denials faltered, his voice grew shrill, and his mask of respectability finally slipped. In that tense, breathless moment, the truth became undeniable. Avery, cornered and desperate, lashed out at Carla, accusing her of turning the town against him with her devil's tongue. But the council would not be swayed this time. The mayor stood and pronounced Avery under arrest for murder, conspiracy, and slander. The crowd erupted in shocked relief, some faces streaked with tears, others burning with shame. For Carla, the victory was not sweet. She looked around the hall and saw the faces of those who had once called her friend, who had turned away in her darkest hour. There was no joy in their apologies, only a heavy sorrow for what suspicion and fear had wrought. Yet as the meeting ended, people slowly approached Carla and John, offering quiet words of regret. Some offered to help, others simply squeezed her hand in silent acknowledgement of the wrong done. The mob that had cast her out was gone, replaced by a chastened community, humbled by the truth and by Carla's courage to stand in its light. Carla walked out of the hall with John and Millie at her side. The sun, climbing higher, warmed her face for the first time in many weeks. There was pain in her heart, an anger that justice had taken so long, but there was also a seed of hope. She had faced her accuser and survived. She had defended not just her name, but the possibility of a future where truth, not fear, would guide their lives. The road ahead was still uncertain. Not all wounds could be healed in a single day. But Carla's dignity was restored, and in that moment, with John and Millie beside her, she felt, for the first time, a sense of belonging stronger than any curse or rumor. The aftermath of Avery's unmasking settled over Redstone like the quiet after a storm, air heavy but cleansed. For days, talk of the confrontation filled every parlor and street corner. Old prejudices forced into the open where they could be named and examined. Carla's name, once spoken in fearful whispers, was now on everyone's lips in a new light. Some with awe, some with regret, and a few still clinging to old suspicions that would take longer to fade. Carla herself felt the change most acutely in the silence that followed. The sharp edge of fear had been dulled, replaced by an unfamiliar freedom. She no longer flinched at every knock on the door or shied from the gaze of townsfolk. Instead, she held her head high, her dignity restored not by their approval, but by her refusal to be broken. The worst had come and passed. Now, life, raw, fragile, and real, beckoned her forward. Millie never left her side. The child, once a shadow on the edge of the crowd, now clung to Carla's hand with an unwavering devotion. The bond forged in exile was deeper than blood. When the mayor called for a public meeting to clear Carla's name, he offered her an official pardon and a place in the community. But it was the quiet, personal moments that mattered more. An old neighbor arriving with a loaf of fresh bread. Mrs. Childers pressing a handkerchief into Carla's palm with a whispered apology. The town's children, emboldened by their parents, returning shyly to Carla's porch, eager for stories and sweets. Carla found herself facing a different decision, whether to accept the town's invitation to return, to step back into the life that had once been hers. The wounds ran deep, and some scars would never fade. But Millie's presence softened the hard places in her heart. The orphan had no other home to return to, and Carla, who had lost so much, saw the chance to become a mother, not just in title but in the steady, nurturing acts of daily life. John Harper was the quiet anchor in this new chapter. The townsfolk had grown to respect him even more for his steady defense of Carla, and the story of his own loss gave him a gravitas that soothed old fears. It was he who suggested the idea of a new beginning, not just for Carla and Millie, but for others who had known pain and rejection. "There are many in this town who've been hurt, pushed aside, or misunderstood," he said one evening, as the sun faded behind the hills. "What if we built something for them? A place of healing, of learning, of welcome." Carla felt a surge of hope, cautious but bright. Together, they began to plan. A small clinic, part apothecary, part home, where Carla's knowledge of herbs could blend with John's formal training. Millie, eager to help, learned to gather ingredients and tend to the garden that would soon overflow with healing plants. Word spread, and before long, a steady stream of visitors found their way to Carla's door, some seeking medicine, others comfort, and many simply curious to see if kindness could thrive where cruelty once had. The town, too, was changing. People who had once turned away from one another now found themselves united by the ordeal they had witnessed. The mayor, chastened by his role in the injustice, vowed to lead with more compassion. Children played together again without glancing over their shoulders. Even those who had stood silent in the face of Carla's exile began to reach out, offering what they could: a helping hand, a bushel of apples, a new fence for the garden. Still, not every heart was changed overnight. Some eyes remained wary, some voices still sharp with suspicion, but they no longer defined Carla's days. She had survived the worst the town could offer and emerged with her spirit unbroken. It was a different kind of power, one born not of fear, but of resilience and grace. In the quiet of early morning, Carla completed the legal adoption of Millie. The process was simple: a signature, a promise, and the blessing of the community. But for Carla, it was a transformation. She was no longer just a survivor or a healer. She was a mother, bound by love and responsibility. Millie beamed with shy pride, clutching the certificate in hands, still small, but no longer trembling. As the seasons shifted, the little household flourished. John became not just a partner in healing, but a steady presence at the table, his laughter and stories weaving through the evenings like music. Sometimes Carla caught herself wondering at the path that had led her here. Through grief, suspicion, exile, and finally, belonging. The days were still hard. The memory of injustice lingered, and some nights Carla woke with her heart racing, the old fears not fully gone. But each sunrise brought a new chance: a meal shared, a wound tended, a child's laughter echoing through the open windows. Most of all, she cherished the peace she had fought so hard to earn. She had found a home not in the approval of the crowd, but in the steadfast love of a child, the trust of a friend, and the quiet, enduring hope that grows in the hearts of those who refuse to give up. The seasons circled in their eternal dance, carrying redstone from the ashes of one harsh winter into the gentle promise of spring. In the weeks and months after Carla's exoneration, life at the edge of town quietly transformed. Where fear and suspicion once thrived, healing and hope now took root. Carla, Millie, and John made a home together. Three souls once broken by loss and exile, now united by kindness and purpose. The old Tyndale cottage was repaired and expanded, its garden bursting with color. Rows of lavender and sage, clusters of wild mint, new beds for vegetables, and the healing herbs Carla tended with steady hands. John built a shaded porch where the three would gather in the evenings, sharing stories and plans as the sun dipped behind the hills. Their new clinic became a place of comfort for many. Carla's hands, so often doubted, proved gentle and skilled. She blended the old wisdom passed from her mother and father with the careful science John had brought from distant cities. The townsfolk came seeking remedies for their aches and fevers, but found more than medicine. They found listening, patience, and acceptance. Even those who had once scorned Carla now left with quiet thanks, their fears slowly unlearning themselves in the presence of her unwavering grace. Millie flourished in this new world, where she once wandered the town's edges with wary eyes and hollow cheeks. She now darted through the garden barefoot, laughter trailing behind her like wind chimes. She learned to read and write, to grind roots and identify wildflowers, her questions filling the kitchen with energy. She was daughter, apprentice, and, most precious of all, a living testament to second chances. Each night, Carla tucked her in beneath a quilt they had sewn together, offering a goodnight kiss that Millie accepted with open arms. John, too, found healing. The pain of his wife's loss never disappeared, but it softened in the warmth of new beginnings. He and Carla shared long talks on the porch, swapping memories and lessons, growing slowly from friendship into the kind of trust that runs deeper than words. Together, they found new ways to serve the town, organizing lessons for children, sharing food with widows and wanderers, opening their doors to anyone in need. Their home became a quiet refuge for others. Soon, word spread beyond Redstone. Drifters arrived, an elderly woman cast out from her distant family, a runaway boy with more scars than stories, a miner left with a cough from years underground. Each was welcomed, fed, and given work or a warm bed, the cottage's circle widening to include all who carried sorrow or longing. No questions were asked of the past. Only hope was planted for the future. Carla often walked the edge of her land at dusk, the sky painted in gold and violet. Sometimes she would pause by the garden, breathing in the scents of basil and earth, and marvel at the changes wrought by time, forgiveness, and perseverance. The past no longer haunted her with its ghosts. Instead, it whispered quiet reminders of the price of courage, the bitterness of injustice, and the stubborn, astonishing power of compassion. One evening, as the spring air shimmered with birdsong, Carla sat with John and Millie on the porch, a lantern glowing softly beside them. The shadows lengthened across the yard, mingling with laughter and the gentle hum of peace. For the first time, Carla allowed herself to truly relax, to let her guard down, to trust that the worst had finally passed. The townsfolk, changed by what they had witnessed, had begun to learn from their mistakes. The mayor visited often, helping repair fences or carrying baskets of apples. Mothers came seeking advice. Children with scraped knees were comforted. Old quarrels were settled with new humility. Carla saw it in their eyes. Not only contrition, but a longing to build something better from the ruins of old fear. And so, the days passed, marked not by scandal or suffering, but by work, love, and the gentle rhythm of belonging. The clinic flourished, its shelves filled with cures and comforts. The kitchen bustled with shared meals and laughter. The garden grew wild and abundant, echoing the lives it sheltered. Carla watched as Millie taught a new orphan to tie shoes, as John read stories aloud to a group of children sprawled in the grass, as strangers became friends and friends became family. If scars remained on Carla's heart, on the memories of Redstone, they were softened by forgiveness and new life. The town would never be perfect, but it had learned the most important lesson, that courage is not loud or easy, but found in the quiet endurance of those who refuse to be broken. That family is not always born, but sometimes made. That love, stubborn and slow, can turn even the deepest exile into home. As the sun set in a blaze of color, Carla leaned back in her chair, Millie's head on her shoulder, John's hand resting warmly on hers. Laughter drifted through the open window, mingling with the scent of bread and wild mint. Night gathered, soft and safe, as a new future waited to be written. This was not just survival, it was the triumph of kindness, the redemption of lost souls, the promise that out of brokenness can grow the strongest, sweetest bonds of all. And as darkness settled peacefully over the cottage, Carla knew she had found, at last, a home that could never be taken away.